talk Fightnomics with Reed Kuhn. We've got to bring him on. That means UFC is really kind of kicking up this week. First thing off, Reed, we've got the Ultimate Fighter 20, and that means that we've got the Women's Strawweight Division Championship going to be decided. Women's Strawweight carried over from Invicta. It's now starting to really become something of where we might actually have some challengers from the women's division to actually look at and say, hey, there's actually some people here of viable candidacy for championship bouts.
Yeah, they basically took the top 16 women in the world for that division and created a whole TV show around it, tournament style with seedings and everything. And I think that was a very compelling way to do this. The Ultimate Fighter reality show, I mean, again, it's season 20. It's been around for a while, and it probably was losing a bit of the viewership that it had early on when it was still something very exciting and new to see a show and people would fight on the show. So this was a nice rebound. I mean, it was very compelling. The level of talent per fighter is very high because they did go after the best in the world rather than prospects. And so now we also have vested interest in all these characters they've built up. And there are some intense rivalries as well. So the fact that we're going to see a champion crowned on Friday night in a brand new division is fitting. It makes sense because they took the best in the world. And then we also have all that energy that was put into building up these people throughout the show, even the ones that didn't win. We now have some very good rivalries that we're going to see pan out as well. So it was a very good way to do this, to introduce the new division. And it's made for good TV viewing. I must say, this was a very good season, compelling season, and there's some exciting matchups, despite the fact that this will be the first time where you have a UFC fight card that is predominantly female. Most of the fights on Friday night will be female. There'll be some men's fights that are featured bouts, but it's a mostly female card, and it's a really good female card.
Does that mean that it's going to be a coming out party for females, or are we still waiting to see what actually transpires? Are we going to see more divisions kind of move over from Invicta, or is it going to take a little while?
I'm not sure if we're going to see more divisions just yet. I think they intentionally created a buffer. They went from 135, built that around Ronda Rousey, and then they're bringing in the 115ers. They intentionally skipped a division because they didn't want too many fighters to migrate from 135 down to 125 or vice versa. They wanted to kind of grab a different population of fighters, a different size, to keep them separate so that they could have a core group and build around that. Too much migration between them could dilute one division or the other, so they wanted to avoid that. So there was some thought process that went into intentionally grabbing the 115ers. I think it'll be probably a long time before we see another division come in, but they did go about this the right way.
And then following that, you also have the small cage. Now, this is something that's really passionate to your heart because you've actually done some study of it. But what are the advantages and disadvantages of the small cage? And have we seen some criticisms of having this implementation of something smaller than it's been before? I know that sometimes this leads to better fights, but sometimes that might change the strategy as well.
That's true. It's an effect that hasn't really been discussed a lot outside of in the Fightnomics book. I wrote about comparing the WEC cage, which was smaller before the fighters were merged into the UFC, the smaller divisions, and what happened there. And then we did see some differences. And so now, over the past 2 years, the UFC has been using a small cage occasionally. It's not a lot of times. I mean, we're only talking a handful of events, maybe 10 events or so, actually a little bit more. But it's enough. It's enough sample size that when we analyze it, we found that the finish rate, the number of fights ending by TKO or submission, is significantly higher in the smaller cage than the larger cage. So I have a 2-part series on this, analyzing the cage size effect on my website. I'm calling it the finisher's cage. And the reason for the additional finishes was not what I expected. I expected just more engagement, more interaction between the fighters, having less room to roam. What I think is actually going on is that when an aggressor hurts their opponent, the opponent just has less room to get away and to recover, and that's what's leading to the increase in finish rates. But we're also seeing it on the ground. We're seeing more aggressive submission attempts. So it's interesting. We're calling it the finisher's cage. It has led to more exciting fights recently in the UFC. In this particular circumstance, they're using it because the event is actually in the Palms Casino, which is a much smaller venue, but that used to be what they used for all Ultimate Fighter finales. So it's nothing unusual. It just happens to be the small cage. So I'm glad people are talking about it. Some fighters think, it gives them less room to set up striking attacks. They don't quite have the wind-up space and the time to react. Other fighters love it. Tim Kennedy famously said, if he's pursuing someone, it's a lot easier for him to cut them off than when they're in a large cage and you see guys getting to endless circling. So pros and cons are out there. Obviously, I think we should just open the discussion and acknowledge that there is inherently something different. I mean, if you change the size of the baseball field, you're going to see some different things happening, more home runs, but also maybe a change in strategy. So fighters do need to understand that there is a difference. Training camps need to properly train for that environment because they might spoil their fighters being in a small training cage, and then they put them in a large cage, and all of a sudden they can't quite pursue people as well. So it's just something that we should acknowledge and understand. And so I will be sending a report to the UFC as well as media probably within the next week or so about the small cage effect, because we have one this Friday and we might actually have one a week from Saturday down in Brazil. And Lyoto Machida is on that card, a guy famous for his striking skills, but equally famous for sometimes not engaging much in the beginning of a fight. And so you put that guy in a small cage, and I'm very interested to see what happens.
But this comes up to the whole idea that we may actually drastically change the UFC simply by reducing the cage. If there are people that have been notorious for moving around the cage, liking to set up, trying to dance around their opponent, all of a sudden you change that, doesn't it change the amount of theater that you even have for the audience's expectation of what they're going to get out of a fight to begin with?
To some extent, yes. I mean, it's not such a glaring difference that it hit everybody in the face, because we did have to run some numbers on this just to confirm that the effect was real. But at the end of the day, I do think that just being open and visible about it is probably the most important step, because you do have some fighters not even knowing what size cage they're getting into on fight night, and that's inexcusable. I mean, at this level, they should know exactly what they're getting into. They should be properly training for it. And if we do see some stylistic changes, so be it. The sport has rapidly evolved so quickly over the last 20 years. Styles do change, and there are underlying trends within the sport that have changed just within the last few years. So you change the cage size, and yes, you will see some differences. It's not necessarily a bad thing or a good thing, but it's something that we should understand and also be more public about.
Okay, so then this Saturday, December 12th, UFC's Fox card is heavyweight loaded. Is this a good thing for the sport to really get that heavyweight division up and cranking? I mean, for a while it's been welterweights and even down to strawweights and featherweights and flyweights to even kind of get some of the passion out for some of the championship bouts. Is it really good to have the heavyweights kind of show that they're really ready to play in this division?
Yeah, there's simply not as many heavyweights, just because, I mean, think of a normal distribution of the average person in size. There's just not as many big guys around, let alone at the high level to compete in MMA. So it is a shallow division, but it's also a very high profile division, because it goes back to boxing. I mean, it's the heavyweights that matter back from the Mike Tyson days. Right now, where it's actually a bit of a different environment because we don't have those big stars. But in the UFC, definitely heavyweights do matter a little bit more. Some analysis was run a couple of years ago. We found that the heavyweights are compensated per fight higher than any other weight class. They're also arguably taking more damage. I mean, these are big guys. They can't take the hits. They do finish a large number of fights by knockout, and that may be the secret here. The Fox cards, lately they've been putting a title fight on there just to build the audience. This is a fight card on Big Fox in network primetime. They only have 4 fights to air on Fox. The rest of them will be on Fox Sports, the prelims. So they want to put their best foot forward. They've done a good job loading up those cards with high-quality talent. This time they are featuring a lot of heavyweights, as well as the return of Nate Diaz, which is another fan favorite. So this should be a big-time successful show that happens on Saturday night. We should see a lot of highlight reel finishes, probably because of the heavyweight presence, and they're probably banking on that. They need to find ways to bring new eyeballs to the sport, give them something exciting on their first taste, so that later they're willing to pay for that pay-per-view.
Is there also maybe a little bit of a strategy by the UFC, though, in terms of talent? You want to get the heavyweights before they decide to go over to a boxing type of feel. That way they come into MMA and they say, hey, there's more incentive to come over here and fight, because the division isn't as, I guess, sought out as some of the lower divisions, and maybe there's a chance to win a title pretty quick.
That's true. In a shallow division, yeah, you're always only 2 fights away probably from serious title contention, and that's true, I think, for most of the guys competing this weekend. I mean, none of them are. There isn't an actual title on the line, but you do have Junior Dos Santos, who held it briefly, and he is a perennial contender. He's kind of the mandatory number 1 challenger to the throne of Cain Velasquez on everybody's vote card. But then you have this giant pool of the next step down. After Junior Dos Santos, there's a lot of game players in that division, and they just gotta duke it out and figure out who's really next in line. They've had a little bit of a logjam with some of the same characters up there at the top, trading off wins and losses, and that slows the churn of the title down, bringing in fresh talent. So you've got Alistair Overeem, was a huge star, K1 kickboxer. He's fighting fellow Dutchman Stefan Struve, who's making his return from a health scare with his heart. And you've also got Matt Mitrione in a slugfest with Gabriel Gonzalez, Brazilian. I mean, these guys are all finishers. They're exciting, and they're heavyweights. And seeing heavyweights duke it out, you're right. You made a point about the boxing fans. Boxing fans are largely unaware of their heavyweights at the moment. All the attention is on Mayweather and Pacquiao. And beyond those two, most people couldn't name who the heavyweights are. So the UFC giving this free product of heavyweights duking it out should be pretty enticing to anybody who's just casually in the bar or scrolling through the channels. They see this. They might be a little bit more inclined to spring for the next pay-per-view.
Exactly, and now part of that big pay-per-view, of course, is the return of Nate Diaz, which you mentioned. Is this going to be short-lived? He does have a big, tough opponent, but, is this part of that narrative that you kind of need to make sure that you actually see somebody when they're coming off of, coming back into the UFC, that they're actually going to have a chance to really do some damage and really be a contender once again?
I think he's one of those guys that is a contender kind of at all times. He loses one, he wins one. He fought for a title. He went 5 rounds with Benson Henderson. Took an eye poke early in that fight, may have changed the outcome, but he is a very talented fighter. He's more importantly a huge fan favorite. People love this guy. The Diaz brothers in general, huge fan following. They've had trouble at the highest level winning those title shots, but they've gotten there, and I think part of that is because they get pushed there because of their momentum and on all the fan support. But they are exciting, and there is no doubt about it. These guys like to fight. They don't take a very conservative approach to their fight game, and that's what people like to see. So the fact that he had a little bit of some angst with his contract, he took some time off, but he has been performing. You bring him back. They're certainly not doing him any favors. They're giving him a very tough opponent. I mean, I think the number 3 or 4 ranked guy in the lightweight division, and the lightweight division is arguably the deepest division in the UFC. So it's going to be an uphill battle. I think he will probably open. I think the odds will be released later today. I'm guessing he's going to be a slight underdog. But, if he wins, instant contention for the title because he's getting past a big-time test. And so it's a good co-main event. It's interesting. They're promoting this one above 2 other heavyweight cards, including Alistair Overeem's fight, which would be unthinkable. Here's a guy who came in, destroyed Brock Lesnar, and was a superstar. And here he is now leading off the card while Nate Diaz is going to be in the co-main event. So that just shows you the star power this guy has.
Well, does that mean that he's not going to star in another Expendables movie? That's all I want to know. How do we keep the Expendables from happening? I guess one of the people that is actually coming in the UFC that we should talk about is an Olympic wrestler. Henry Cejudo. Now, tell me about Henry and exactly where we see this guy matching up and whether or not he's going to be for real or, possibly somebody who's a flash in the pan.
Yeah, whenever you bring an Olympic caliber wrestler over to the UFC, they have generally done very, very well. And so this is the latest. He's also the smallest wrestler to come into the UFC. He was trying to make flyweight at a card up in Sacramento. Unfortunately, he had trouble with the weight cut, had some health complications, and they scratched from the card. This will be his debut, and he's actually going to do it one weight class up at bantamweight, and that was kind of the agreement with Dana White, was you need to prove that you can make the weight and perform a few times, and we'll take it from there. So a lot of hype behind this guy. He's undefeated, as many of the Olympic caliber guys are before they come to the UFC. This is a huge litmus test for him, obviously, a step up in competition, bigger stage, bigger weight class. So there's a lot of interesting factors here, but it's hard to argue with that quality of talent, that level of skill, Olympic caliber wrestling, the ability to grind it out round after round, throw people around, really own them on the mat and stifle them. It's a very powerful skill, and the guys have done in the past very well, like I said. So I do expect him to be successful. More importantly, this is a big test. They've got him buried on the undercard, although it is in Phoenix, and they asked to be on the Phoenix card. He's from there. He's got a lot of local support. I'm pretty sure there's like a play written about his life performing down the street in Arizona. He's got big-time sponsors as well because of the Olympics. So this is a different type of athlete, different feel when he comes in to the UFC, because this is more of an experiment for him where he might even compete for the Olympics down the road again. So that would actually be a big deal for the UFC to have one of their own athletes then go off and go back to the Olympics down the road. And so I think people want to see him be successful here. Most importantly, we just have to see him fight. We have to see him make weight and then fight, and I'm looking forward to that.
So I guess to follow up, we also have another story about the UFC getting into the media. This one being at Foxcatcher, the movie that's coming out. I recently saw it, and my question to you is this allowing the UFC to have some kind of permeance? I know that it's about the Olympic part of that person's life, but at the same time, they won UFC 9. They did kind of get in and when the UFC started. Is this allowing the UFC to kind of have a permeance, kind of in the same way boxing did with the pugilist and other types of movies, to where we're actually going to see more of an embrace collectively of really this is a sport?
Yeah, I think so. And getting into popular media is a very important tactic that the UFC is looking to do. They're partnering with movies. We've seen a few before. This is very important, I think. As you said, as we establish mixed martial arts as the premier combat sports league or sports type above wrestling or boxing, that's still, most people won't accept that the UFC is above boxing because you look at individual pay-per-view numbers in boxing, Pacquiao is still going to way outdraw the UFC. But it's hard to say that, the UFC isn't making a very good case for this. You ask a 12-year-old or a high school kid who your favorite fighter is, or when you think of a fighter, who is it, what do they look like, they're starting to think more about a mixed martial arts fighter, a John Jones, a Ronda Rousey, rather than a famous boxer or a wrestler. And I think boxing was always ahead of wrestling in that respect because of, it was a professional sport, high profile, whereas wrestling was more college and Olympics. And now UFC is able to kind of span both of them, and they're pulling from all the right places. They're trying to get into media, and that's a very important tactic for them to mainstream their sport, so that when you think of combat sports, you're imagining a mixed martial arts fight, not a boxing match, not a wrestling match. So steps like this to get into popular media, especially a high-profile movie like Foxcatcher. This isn't a fringe movie like one built around MMA. This is a legit, major movie. So I think it was very important for them to try to partner in and do whatever they can to even get a little shout out, because it helps them.
Well, exciting stuff. Thank you, Reed Kuhn, for coming on. Fightnomics, his book. Please buy it, because you want to know exactly what's going on the hidden side of UFC and MMA. Thank you for coming on once again.
Thank you. Enjoy the fights.